Auctions have existed for millennia and have been used to sell a wide variety of items ranging from treasury notes to Dorothy's ruby slippers. When it comes to auctions, people usually envision a fast-talking auctioneer who solicits progressively higher bids until the end when he pounds his gavel and says going once, going twice, sold to the highest bidder. But what most people don't know is that there are actually a wide variety of auction types, each with its own rules and subtleties. Principles of economics tells us that supply and demand help a market set its price, so why hold an auction in the first place? Well, the basic idea is that auctions are used when there is not an established market for the good being sold, and the auction provides a way of discovering the price. And the price that is settled on greatly depends on the rules of the auction, from which there are many to choose. Most auction rules we see today have been honed over the years based on successes and failures. Economists study these rules by using mathematical models and experiments to predict what will happen as rules change. Should bids be cried out in the open, or should they be submitted secretly? Should there be a reserve price, or should it be an absolute auction where someone will win no matter what the price? These are just a few of the questions that auction theory tries to answer using mathematical models. And that's what led me to start working with Sean Ellermeyer from the math department. Medicare had introduced a rather complex new auction, and no one was quite sure what the results would be. So I began analyzing the model of the auction and came up with a fascinating but tough differential equation. Stuck, I reached out to Sean in hopes he could help.
Brett Katzman and I got together for lunch one day at the Commons because he wanted to show me a differential equation he'd been studying. He wanted to know if I thought I could solve the equation, or at least try to discern some of the properties of its solutions. At the time, I didn't know anything about auction theory. Even though I had no idea why this particular equation was being used to model an auction, I decided that I'd take up the challenge of trying to elicit some of its mathematical properties. My experience with differential equations and mathematical modeling provided me with many of the tools that I needed. But in order to really understand what was going on with that equation, I realized that I actually had to learn a lot more about the economic and game theoretic principles that were used in formulating the equation. That's when Brett and I started working together very closely, with each of us teaching the other new things as we went along, so that we both had a firm grasp on both the economic and mathematical aspects of the research we were doing.
Auction theory is rooted in equilibrium analysis using game theory. Game theory has been used to understand the survival of species, to strategically plan for the D-Day invasion at Normandy, and yes, even to design auctions. The basic idea about game theory is that it asks not just what someone should do in a game, like what to bid, but also how their competitors will respond to what they do, and in turn, how they should respond to that response, and how they should respond to that response to their response, and so on. Now I know that this is starting to sound like a scene from a comedy, but in the end, the mathematics involved actually allows us to predict where everything settles in. And that's what we call equilibrium analysis. By examining equilibrium under different rules, we can determine how a specific rule will affect outcomes by changing it and only it. Will it increase revenues? Will it lower costs to taxpayers? Will it lead to high-quality, low-cost construction firms winning government contracts to build bridges? Mathematical modeling holds the answers.
Mathematical models have been used for centuries to try to understand phenomena in so many different areas. Classical problems in science, like the motion of the planets in relation to one another, or the motion of water waves, or the spread of a disease. All these things can be studied using mathematical models. But with the development of game theory in the 20th century, we could start modeling human interactions. In particular, game theoretic models can be used to investigate the overall societal outcome that results when individual people who are motivated by their own self-interest interact with one another. So whenever you develop and analyze a mathematical model of an auction, the goal is to better understand how participants in the auction behave in relation to one another. How will they bid, and how does the outcome depend on that bidding? We're trying to create a crystal ball of sorts, not only so that we can predict what will happen in auctions, but so that we can design better auctions.
So I've already mentioned that there are a lot of different types of auctions, but why so many? Well, many you see today, like those at Christie's and Sotheby's, have stood the test of time. In a sense, they've won the survival of the fittest because they've generated a lot of revenue. Others have come and gone because they failed to deliver. Still, other types such as eBay have cropped up with improvements in technology, taking the good aspects of the going once, going twice type auction and making it to where you don't have to gather everyone in a single room in Manhattan or London. In fact, eBay provides a great example of how auctions can evolve and improve over time by introducing new rules, examining how they impact outcomes, and then keeping them, removing them, or tweaking them based on the results. But not everyone trying to auction something has the luxury of experimenting over time like eBay. Sometimes a seller wants to get revenue through a single auction and has to decide what rules to use, and there's an immediacy to it. In such instances, mathematical modeling and experimental labs prove useful. Those that know what they're doing or consult someone who does usually end up with good results, but those who try to make up their own rules often face catastrophic results. I've seen beachfront property in the Bahamas sell for pennies on the dollar and silent auctions devolve into fistfights. But these pale in comparison to what could easily be the worst auction ever, and that's the Medicare auction used to set reimbursement prices on home medical equipment that Sean and I studied with Dr. Peter Crampton from the University of Maryland.
The Medicare auction sets prices on things like oxygen tanks, diabetes testing strips, and ventilators. To try to make sure that enough medical equipment was supplied, the Medicare auction selected multiple winners in 100 major metropolitan areas. And although that was normal enough, the way that the auction set prices led to some winners facing reimbursements that were below their costs of provision. That is an unsustainable situation. Bidders cried foul about the outcomes, but Medicare simply saw that as sour grapes about low prices and refused to accept that the prices were too low to be sustainable. And that's where our work came in. Our research provided mathematical evidence that the auction was poorly designed and would lead to market collapse. But more importantly, it also showed that the auction could be easily fixed.
So you might ask why the federal government would pay attention to a bunch of mathematics coming out of Kennesaw State University. Maybe other economists could come up with a rival model. After all, the famous joke says that if you stacked all of the economists end to end, they couldn't reach a conclusion. Well, that's where it gets interesting. Based on our results, our co-author Dr. Crampton collected signatures from 244 of the world's leading auction experts on a letter to President Obama, Congress, and the Department of Health and Human Services. The letter highlighted the problems with the Medicare auction and urged a restructuring based on best practices. We simply could not find a single expert who disagreed with our conclusions. The auction was just that bad. But more importantly, the letter got traction that 10 years of congressional testimony by Dr. Crampton and I couldn't. The letter caught the attention of Representative Tom Price, who introduced legislation to change the format in 2013 to something called the Market Pricing Program. It was an auction based on our research. That bill lost steam when Dr. Price was named to head the Department of Health and Human Services, but it ended up being fortuitous, as it meant Dr. Price didn't need a congressional mandate. He could just change the auction from within. And that's how a simple discussion about differential equations in the commons helped overhaul one of the largest auctions in history.